Welcome to the Healthy Relationships Initiative podcast. Our goal is to provide information and tools to help you build happier, healthier, and safer relationships of all kinds. To learn more about HRI, please visit www.guilfordhri.org and check us out on social media at GuilfordHRI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Healthy Relationships Initiative Relationship Booster. We're glad that you're joining us today. This program is hosted by the Healthy Relationships Initiative, which is a partnership between the Phillips Foundation and UNC Greensboro. And our mission is to promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds in Guilford County and beyond. And we invite you to check out our website at guilfordhri.org to learn more about Healthy Relationships Initiative and a lot of the different resources that we have, as well as connect with us on social media at guilfordhri. I wanted to go over just a few practical details for today's program. This program is being filmed live, and so if you're joining us for today's live program through WebEx, we definitely invite you to submit questions as we go throughout the program. You can do that through the chat room. The best way to do that is to direct them to Camilla, who is our moderator for today's program. And throughout the program and toward the end, we'll be sure to take some of those questions. So feel free to send in any questions that you might have as we're talking throughout the program. And also, probably you did this as you logged in, but we always encourage people to use a username when you log in. However, please keep in mind that we did, for confidentiality purposes, hide the participant list so people can't see what your comments are. And after we've finished our discussion today, but before you sign off, we would really encourage you to please submit your feedback, and Camilla will be sharing a link to the feedback form. We really value the feedback of participants in these programs to help us to continue to improve the programs in the future. So today's program is talking about the subject of problem solving in couples, and we've got a guest with us today who's Dr. Levi Russell Baker, and we'll introduce him in just a moment. But my name is Christine Murray, and I'm the director of the Healthy Relationships Initiative, as well as I'm a professor at UNC Greensboro in the Department of Counseling and Educational Development, where I also coordinate the couple and family counseling. But we're glad to have with us today Dr. Levi Russell Baker, and he is an assistant professor in the UNCG Department of Psychology, and he also directs UNCG's Close Relationships Lab. So thanks so much, Levi, for joining us today. I can't wait to learn from you on this topic.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking with you and talking with our audience.
Great.
Yeah.
So to get us started, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of background about yourself and kind of your professional background, and also why this topic of problem solving in couple relationships is especially of interest to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a social psychologist in the Department of Psychology here at UNCG. And I actually didn't start out being interested in social psychology at all. Like a lot of psychology majors, I was really interested in clinical psychology, and I wanted to be a therapist. So I actually started out in a clinical psychology doctoral program. And wasn't really interested in research at all. I was really kind of focused on kind of getting those applied skills, and like I said, I just wanted to be a therapist. And then I started, kind of progressing through the program, and you start seeing clients, and I found out kind of quickly that that experience was very different than what I expected it to be. I found that a lot of people who I was working with, the people who I was working with, have problems in their lives that were causing distress, that were, problematic for them, and they wanted those problems resolved, but they didn't necessarily want to kind of change some of the things that were creating those problems, which is something I'm sure you in the counseling department kind of see all the time. Someone wants to fix this, and to fix that, they need to change what they're doing, but I don't really want to change doing this because I like doing this, but I somehow want the problem to be resolved. So I was kind of getting a little, there's a little bit of frustration there, but at the same time, it was kind of, I had this realization that we need to know more about this process. We need to know more about how people can solve the problems in their lives, and kind of tackle what motivates people to want to change what they're doing, tackle what factors affect their ability to do so. And it was kind of around that time that I became really interested in the research process, because I thought we needed to kind of have a better understanding of how problem solving works before we can start applying it. At the time I was working, even though I was in a clinical program, I was working with a social psychologist who studied close relationships. And that was also kind of an eye-awakening experience, because before that I didn't know we could even study close relationships. I didn't know there were people that studied love and marriage and attraction and things like that. I kind of always thought that these were topics or questions that couldn't really be studied scientifically. And when I started working with her, I started realizing, no, these are actually topics, these are questions that we can definitely tackle from the scientific, using scientific methods. I fell in love with that. I then kind of just dove completely into social psychology, and over the, I'd say, I'm kind of trying to do the math. I think about 12 years since then have been focusing on romantic relationships, and have been focusing on how people can solve problems in their relationships.
And that's so neat how the questions that really drive your research come from what you saw in your
That's
in your
exactly it.
Even if that didn't become your direct path.
That's exactly it.
Curiosity.
Yes, I was always interested in problem solving, even when I was wanting to be a therapist, because ultimately I think problem solving is the basis of therapy. People are coming in because they have problems, and the two of you are working together to find solutions to them. So then, I took that interest and applied it to kind of a specific domain of looking at that within romantic relationships.
So tell me more about the Close Relationships Lab. It sounds like you got your start doing this research working with somebody else, but what have you been doing here in your time since you've been at UNCG to develop this Close Relationships Lab? Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to kind of back up a little bit. I definitely want to get to the work that I've been doing here, but to kind of provide a little bit of context for that. The work that I was doing as a grad student really kind of set the foundation for a lot of the work that I'm doing today. Just kind of thinking of which direction I want to take this. Okay, I'd say kind of like maybe the impetus for most of my work, that really the groundbreaking part of that came from a project that I was working on that I wasn't super involved with. It was really most of my graduate advisor, and actually my wife, who's also a relationship researcher. The two of them were really working on this, and it was looking at how couples communicate about their problems. And what they were looking at specifically was this category of behaviors known as direct negative behaviors. But essentially what this means is, how much are people blaming their partner for what they're doing? How much do people demand that their partner changes what they're doing? How much do people say, I hate it when you do this, and I want you to do something differently? And for the last 40, 50 years, every bit of advice that people get from self-help books, from magazines, from the pastor standing up there when you're celebrating a marriage, and the pastor's giving all the advice of, all the advice that we get. And actually, all the research is saying that we should avoid these behaviors altogether. We should always be completely positive in our relationships. You should be nice and kind and considerate to your partner. When they're having a bad day, you should take a step back. You should give them room. You shouldn't criticize anything they're doing. You shouldn't try to change them, because that's changing. They want to be an authentic person, so you don't want to change your partner, and all these things. And they were looking, and again, I kind of helped with this a little bit, but they were looking at, is this always a bad thing? Is it always a bad thing to criticize your partner? And what they found, so they're kind of taking a contextual approach and seeing, when is it okay to do this? When is it particularly harmful to do this? And what they kind of surprisingly found was that when people are blaming their partners, when they're demanding changes, commanding your partner, things like that, over relatively big problems, it's actually really beneficial.
the people who were experiencing really severe problems, whether these were problems with infidelity, whether these were problems with partner aggression or violence, if you're dealing with problems arising from alcohol or drug abuse, really big issues, it was actually the people who were blaming one another more that experienced the greatest declines in the severity of their problems. And the other, on the other side of the coin, was that people who are dealing with relatively minor problems. I occasionally leave my shoes out and I forget to take out the trash, things like that. Don't load the dishwasher. Exactly. Yeah, that's such a perfect one. That is such a perfect one. Those people, if they were engaging in those same behaviors, if they were blaming, if they were criticizing, if they were demanding, things like that, they experienced a giant spike in problems. Their problems just really increased in severity. And this was kind of an eye-awakening moment because, again, for like 40 years, everything that the research said was that you shouldn't blame, criticize, demand. And here we had, across several different studies where we're following people over time, we're finding evidence that actually some people, not everyone, but some people are doing better when they're blaming and criticizing and demanding. And this kind of led our lab, I was a junior grad student at the time, but this led our lab to really change our philosophical orientation from, instead of let's look to see what people should do or shouldn't do, instead we need to think about what should people do in these situations when they're facing these problems, when they're with this particular person. Because the behaviors that are effective for some people when they're facing certain types of problems, when you're with a certain partner, that might be effective then, but if you're with a completely different person, that same behavior might be harmful. Or if you're facing a different type of problem, that same behavior might be hurtful. So, that became really the focus of our research at the time, and that's continued since I've been at UNCG, that what we try to do is not only look and see, okay, how are people behaving, how are people trying to solve their problems, but when is it effective, who is it effective for, are there certain situations where these behaviors are going to be more effective or less effective. I'll give you a couple quick examples. One of my studies was looking at blame specifically. So, again, if you have a problem in your relationship, do you tell your partner, hey, I hated it when you did X, Y, Z, or, you should stop doing X, Y, Z. And one thing, another kind of contextual factor that I found really matters is whether or not the partner is experiencing depression. And what we kind of found is that for people who aren't experiencing depression, if you're blaming or criticizing, generally what people do is they listen to the feedback they're given, they think about it for a while, and it might hurt at first, but that kind of just the distress or the discomfort that comes from being told that you're doing something wrong generally kind of motivates people. If you're told by someone you really care about that you're doing something that hurts them, most people's reaction is, oh, stop doing that. But for people who are experiencing depression, they kind of process that information in a different manner. What they usually tend to hear is, you're doing something wrong and there's nothing you can do to fix this problem. And they actually become less motivated to fix their problems over time. So this is kind of another example where, the same thing, just criticizing a partner for some, in certain situations can be really healthy and adaptive, and it can resolve conflict. But if your partner is someone who's experiencing depression and, again, is kind of like looking at the world in a completely different way, it's not going to be particularly effective for them.
And I think hopelessness is a big feature of depression.
Exactly.
So, and I've been hearing a lot more about hope and hope research lately, and it almost seems like if somebody feels hopeful that I can solve this problem, or if I change this, it's going to make my partner feel happier, and this is worth it, then that maybe helps them to push through some of the initial hurt. Versus if somebody has lost a sense of hopefulness, and maybe they feel sort of some hopelessness, then it's harder for them, the motivation would go down.
You're absolutely right. People who aren't experiencing depression, what they hear is, there's this thing that you can do to improve the relationship, and they want to improve the relationship. And for someone who's experiencing depression, what they hear is, the relationship is bad and it's always going to be bad, so why bother? So yeah, hopelessness ties in completely with this. I mean, that was kind of our proposed mechanism there.
It's almost like, too, when I've heard of a fixed mindset versus growth mindset.
Yes.
So to be able to say,
absolutely.
And so I think that's a really good kind of starting takeaway for this
Yeah.
discussion today, is that it is helpful to bring a growth mindset and a sense of hopefulness
Yes.
to problem solving, because even that perspective just seems like it could play a big difference or make a big difference in terms of how effectively a couple is able to navigate a problem that they're facing.
Yes. The research on the growth destiny beliefs, or the fixed incremental, there's a couple different classifications, and I confuse the language on it, but for the audience who might not be familiar with this, this is kind of two different styles of thinking about problems that you're experiencing, and kind of this distinction has been used in academic settings, where for like people who are struggling with a math problem, are you the type of person who thinks, okay, I can really overcome this challenge and I can learn these skills and I can fix this problem and I can do better on this? Or are you the kind of person who says, I'm just not a math person at all, I'm never going to be able to, I'm never going to be a math person? And kind of that distinction between whether you think you can grow and overcome your problems, or is this just an inherent quality of who you are, applies to so many different domains. Even though, again, this kind of got started looking at academic outcomes, it definitely applies to relationships. And one thing that I've kind of dabbled in a little bit, but want to get into a little bit more, is when are each of them beneficial, or when can they be harmful? Like this idea that, yes, I can fix this relationship, we might be having problems, but there's things that I can do to make it better. That might be really good when you're facing problems that are actually solvable, right? So if you're dealing with relatively minor things like, my partner keeps, loading the dishwasher the wrong way, or we're fighting over whatever, that's a very solvable problem. And, having that growth mindset and thinking, yes, we can overcome this, is probably really helpful. If you think, no, we're doomed because we're fighting over the dishwasher, that's probably a bad thing. But if you are dealing with really big issues, like if the two of you are really incompatible, then actually having that growth mindset might be maybe you should have that destiny mindset, and you should say, listen, the two of us are just not compatible, let's call this a day.
Right.
So like one study that I have that kind of relates to this a little bit, we were looking at, it's a construct called relationship self-efficacy, which is basically the extent to which people think they can solve conflicts in their relationships. Like people who are really high in this just kind of tackle their problems and they say, yes, we're having these issues, we're fighting about this, but we can overcome this. And what we were looking at was this belief in the context of people who are in abusive relationships. And what we found is that people who are being abused by their partners, normally that motivates people to want to leave that relationship. But if people were high in relationship self-efficacy, if they thought that there's, I can overcome this problem, they tended to stay in those abusive relationships for longer periods of time. We tracked people over, I think, 2 years in that study. And we found that actually it was these people who were like the most optimistic about their relationships were the ones that were remaining in those relationships. So probably that optimism is good if you're in a good relationship, but being, I want to say, unrealistically.
In some unhealthy situations, or maybe to have a false sense of hope. Like hope is a good thing in general, but if you're maybe in a relationship with somebody and it's like not a healthy relationship and the person isn't willing to change and it's just not going anywhere, it might be more important to be realistically assessing versus from a hopeful lens.
That's exactly it.
Really,
and that's what we kind of argue, is that people need to be more accurate about their relationships than I think we sometimes are. And having those positive biases, in general, if it's still kind of tied to reality, is probably useful. But when it's when they get too extreme, it's probably going to be a little less.
We did a program a couple months ago about one of these relationship boosters about healthy dating relationships, and our featured expert for that time, whose name is Robin Campbell, she said dating is like collecting data. And so you want to collect information. And I've heard it was probably a bumper sticker, but so it's not like clinical research, so everybody understands, but it said that the key to a healthy marriage is before you're married, keep your eyes wide open, and after you're married, keep them half shut.
Yep. I mean, that's funny.
Wisdom.
I know, right?
But it is true. I think what you're speaking to, even though we're kind of making light of it a little bit, but Like you said earlier, different situations call for different problem-solving strategies.
Exactly it.
Sometimes it's helpful if there's a real problem to really say, we need to work on this,
Yes.
we need to change it, it's changeable, you're willing to work on it. Sometimes it's more useful to say, this person isn't working on it, this is a really unhealthy situation, I need to figure out what my next step is. And sometimes it's probably good to, you know, just accept things the way they are. I mean, I think about things like the dishwasher, and it's like, you know, maybe they don't do it exactly the way you want, but you have to just accept that it is and not, and kind of let some things go.
Yeah, you need to evaluate, like, what am I getting out of it? If I make this a big deal, and I kind of, the way I think about it is like, how much capital am I using right now? Like, how much am I expending? You know, is it worth getting into this argument? And yes, maybe my partner is going to load the dishwasher right the next time, and that's good, I guess. But is it really worth that? Like, if we look at it from a cost-benefit perspective, probably not. But if we're dealing with something else, like something that is more consequential, maybe you do want to kind of put a little bit more pressure there.
I think it's always a good idea to think about what are the non-negotiables, kind of, and then what are the things that you can let go. And so, you know, certainly we would say a healthy relationship has to have respect in it, right? So, you know, to be able to say that people need to learn to be respectful of each other, and you should expect that in a relationship. But are there other things that may not be as essential that you could let go? Like maybe, you know, one person's a little bit more of a saver, the other person's a little bit more of a spender. And so that really starts to play into some of the problem-solving aspects of couple relationships. So just thinking about the problem-solving, why do couples, what are some of the reasons why a couple may struggle to be able to effectively solve the problems in their relationship?
Yeah, and it really depends on what the issue they're facing is. I think, you know, in general, kind of the work that we do kind of distinguishes between two different types of problems. One are just problems that come up because life is life. It's not necessarily there's a problem in the relationship. It's someone in that relationship is facing a problem just due to life because of health. You know, you might be facing a health problem. You may be dealing with financial difficulties. You might, you know, things like that. There's kind of problems external to the relationship that come up. And so that's kind of one category of problems that we oftentimes see. And even though it probably, you know, oftentimes those problems are affecting one person more than another, because people are close to one another and because people support one another and because people work on their problems together, that problem tends to affect both people. The other category is problems that are occurring within that relationship, and usually those are just emerging because of different goals that we have, different motives that we have, different desires, different expectations that we have. Really, you know, again, those are kind of emerging because people want different things. You know, I want to look at that attractive person that I see crossing the street, and my partner does not want me to do that, right? So we've got different goals in that particular moment. I think, you know, so why do people struggle with this? I think, you know, we've kind of talked about one reason, which is that oftentimes people kind of get into a habit of how you should behave. Or how you should tackle problems. And like what we were just saying is every problem is different, every person is different, every context is different, and we might, you know, I have learned that there's certain ways that I can resolve problems with my mom, and how I go about solving problems with her is completely different than how I try to solve problems with my wife. That's completely different than how I'm going to solve problems with a colleague at work, right? And I can say that and rationally think that, but oftentimes we don't do that. You know, oftentimes we have just kind of learned, hey, this is really effective, and I'm going to use this same tool in every single situation that I have. So I think one thing that people struggle with is oftentimes they don't use the right tool for the job because we kind of just get in a habit of using the same approach. And I think we need to be a little bit more mindful of the specific situation that we're in, the specific person that we're dealing with, what the problem is, things like that. I think a couple other things that kind of come to mind. One, we need to be more mindful that our partners are dynamic people. that, if I'm talking to my wife in the morning, she is going to be a completely different person than when I talk to her in the afternoon after a stressful day of work. Or, if she just got a wonderful job evaluation, she's going to be in a better mood. And the tools I'm going to use when trying to solve a problem with her in that moment will be completely different than if she just got some really bad news or something like that. And I think rationally we know that. We know that we're different in different situations. Sometimes we have really lousy days, and we know we're going to behave in a different way. Or, I ate a bag of M&Ms and I'm really happy that I'm a different person in that moment, right? Like, we know that we change as people. And rationally, we know that our partners are changing depending on their mood and what's going on in their lives and things like that. But in the moment, oftentimes we don't realize that. And I think that, this is kind of a struggle with a lot of this. Like, when you're trying to give advice to people, it's you can give advice and say, hey, be more mindful of this, but it needs to happen in that moment, which is oftentimes difficult to do. It's like, I know if I'm having a problem with my wife, I know certain ways that I can raise that and it'll be really successful. But there are certain situations that I need to take a completely different approach, and sometimes I just forget that. Or sometimes I don't know what's going on in her life.
So it really seems like another practical takeaway that people can apply in their lives is the importance of just taking some time to really do a real thorough evaluation and assess the situation and be intentional in how you're responding to your problem rather than just dive right in, use the habits and the ways that you've always done it in the past. Because if you do that, it might work, but it's probably more likely to work if you sit down and say, okay, what kind of problem am I dealing with? What does that look like in the relationship? Maybe how does my partner's views on this differ from mine? So I might need to think about it differently. How stressful is it? Just really break it down and think through what's worked in managing problems with this person in the past versus other people. Or, just taking that time to break it down before you jump in and start trying to solve it.
I completely agree, and this actually leads to the last thing I was going to say. So getting back to the question was, why do people struggle? Oftentimes people struggle because they don't have those resources, and by resources I mean sometimes they don't have the time, or they're mentally exhausted. And again, you come home after a long day of work, you put in a long shift. You have to take care of the kids. You are, managing other household responsibilities. You're doing all of this stuff, and let's say you do get into an argument with your partner about whatever's going on. You don't have the mental, I want to say you don't have the mental capacity in that moment. But what you were describing, one, is so important. That's what we need to be doing. But we don't always have the ability or the time, or we're just too burnt out to actually do all of that as well as we should. And so that calls for making time, and so, one of the things that, I kind of tell my undergrads, so oftentimes I teach a class in close relationships, and you may have heard this, one of the pieces of advice that I always got, when you get married, is never go to bed angry. Completely disagree with that.
I am with you on that.
Completely disagree with that 100%. I think the nugget of truth in that statement is don't ignore problems, right? And yes, it's a good idea to not ignore problems, but work on those problems. Try to solve those problems when you're able to. When carve out that time. Approach your problems in the morning when you're refreshed and relaxed, and you actually like seeing this person again. Find the times where you're going to be effective at solving those problems. And I guarantee, again, if you've been working a late shift and you come home and you have to make dinner and you have to clean up the house and do all those things, and it's 11 at night and you have to wake up at 5 the next morning, you are not going to be effective at solving your problems. You're not going to be listening to what your partner has to say. You're not going to be putting yourself in their position. You're not going to be talking about what your goals and motives are compared to their goals and motives and figure it. You're not going to be doing any of that. All in that moment you hear is, you're telling me I'm doing something wrong, I'm a bad person, and I want to tell you you're a bad person, and it's not going to be constructive in any way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I say that often too, that some of these things that we think are true about relationships aren't necessarily true, but I think the other, like you said, the nugget of truth about it, but the other piece that I would add too, just from experience working with couples and counseling, is to try to separate the person from the problem.
Yes.
To be able to really say, okay, we're not going to solve this tonight,
Absolutely.
but let's just spend, 10 minutes just talking about something else, or each make clear, like, we're going to solve this tomorrow, because otherwise everybody's going to go to sleep. Nobody's going to sleep well, and the next day they're not going to be in the right mindset to solve the problem either.
Exactly.
So, really be able to say, okay, we've got this problem, but I still care about you, or, this relationship is important to me and I want to work on it. And sometimes I think those things are kind of, soothing to hear and help you say, and just reassuring that we can solve this, but I agree with you that people do need to, there's that balance there, because sometimes people do run away from problems and they don't address them.
Yeah, exactly.
And, that's not healthy either, but to be able to kind of say, like, we'll talk about this, why don't we talk about this tomorrow at lunchtime?
Right.
Let's meet for lunch and let's sit down and let's talk about this when we've both had some time.
Exactly.
And work through that, and I think having that team kind of mentality.
Right.
But I wanted to talk with you, one of the things since I became since my training in couple and family counseling, learning about the research of Dr. John Gottman, one of the most sort of noted marriage researchers of our time. And he had some really interesting findings that I remember just learning about. It was very surprising and sort of very influential for me when I was first learning about marriage and couple relationships, because he talked about perpetual problems. And he said that 70% of conflict in couple relationships is about perpetual problems. And the idea of perpetual problems is being that, we assume couples like you should be able to solve all the problems. But in fact, there's a lot of problems in relationships that keep coming up, and it's not necessarily about solving them, it's just about managing them. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and even if there's aspects of your research.
Gottman loved his big stats and saying, like, oh, it's 70%, or I can predict who's getting divorced within 98% accuracy or whatever. Gottman loved his giant stats. I do completely agree with John in the sense that, problems really vary in how solvable and how severe they are. There are, and kind of addressing the solvability issue, I mean, there are problems that are very easy to solve. There are problems that you can't solve, but you can manage in some ways. For example, if I find out that my spouse has, again, kind of like a chronic medical issue, we might not be able to solve that, but man, the rest of our life we're going to be dealing with that. Finances is often kind of in that same category where it's like, if we just don't make enough to get by or to barely get by, oftentimes we're going to be dealing with this for a long period of time. And, what would solve that problem? Well, winning the lottery, or something like that. But that's probably not going to happen. And we just need to learn how to manage this. And that's not to say that we can't improve our situation. We definitely can. But the problem might not go away completely. And then there are problems that are completely unsolvable. There are problems that we are just never going to fix. These are never going to get better. And I don't know what led John to say 70% are perpetual. I'm sure he had data on that. But we definitely see that, again, that problems do vary in their how solvable they are. And I mean, I think that's something that people need to evaluate realistically, and oftentimes we don't. We don't take a step. When we're dealing with that problem, we're just thinking about what can we do to fix this problem, and we probably need to kind of take a step back and evaluate: is this something that we can solve? Is this something that we won't solve, but we can manage and we can make better? Or is this something that we're going to be dealing with for a long period of time? And if it's something that, if it's if it's the latter, that it's like we can't solve this. This is just something that we're going to be dealing with forever, or at least a long period of time. And we really realistically need to be thinking about, like, is this something we're comfortable with? And, if it's finances or something like that, maybe there's not a whole lot we can do. But, if we're dealing with massive incompatibilities, let's say just differences in political or religious beliefs, and I am a diehard liberal and my partner is a diehard conservative and we're constantly fighting about that. I'm never going to change her mind. She's never going to change my mind. And I know for the next 20 years that's not going to change. We need to think about how we can deal with this, right? Is this something that we can just say, yes, this problem is always going to be there, but we can manage it by never talking politics in front of one another, something like that. Or is this something that I just am not comfortable dating someone who has this belief system, and because this person is never going to change their belief system, maybe the two of us just aren't great together. And maybe we kind of, if that is a deal breaker, then maybe we need to be going our separate ways. But I think no matter what conclusion you come to, you need to be evaluating, is this something that can be solved or not? Is this something that can be managed or the problem reduced in some way? Because ultimately, I think that changes how we approach the situation. If my goal is to change my partner's political beliefs, I'm probably not going to, and I'm going to be that's going to lead to just a lot of fighting over the next however many years. But if I accept, okay, that's who they are, and I'm okay with that, well, that's going to change my approach. Or if I decide that's who they are and I don't want to be with that person, that's going to change my approach. But you need to evaluate that as at least the first step. Yeah. And I don't think we always do that.
Yeah. I think people sometimes get very focused on their views and what they want and what they want to see without maybe taking that step back to say, is this even the right relationship to be in? Or is there a different way versus I want to change this person's views, or I want to change how they're doing this or their behavior versus maybe, can I accept this?
Right.
People sometimes don't, think about that. It's a common thing in marital therapy for people to be like, change this person, not like maybe there's things about me that I can change. And, and I think it's also, I like what you talked about, different types of problems. And so, there's definitely the little problems. So let's kind of break those down a little bit because different problem-solving approaches apply to different problems.
Right.
So something little, let's say, is a very theoretical, although, you'd be surprised how many couples come to counseling over, like, who takes the trash out. I always talk about that when I'm training my students, and they laugh so hard because they can all relate to the idea.
So, I mean, what we do, and I haven't really gotten into our methods at all, but, like, what we do in our lab is we bring couples into the lab, and we have each person identify what a problem in their relationship is. And I would say at least 15% of people, their biggest problem is we can't agree on where to go to dinner at night. That it's like we're too lazy to cook. We need to, get food. Well, where do you want? That's a huge problem for it. It's ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous, but it's real. It is real.
Let's talk about little ones, okay?
Yeah.
So seemingly little, it may mean a lot to somebody, so I certainly don't want to sort of invalidate it. Anybody who's listening and is like, you know what, that actually is.
Yes.
But what are some kind of steps that people can go through if it's like something that really should be pretty solvable? Like there is a possible solution to that, right? Like go here for you tonight, go pick my pick tomorrow night and call it in. Or, there's little kind of things they can do, but how do they do that? And then we'll tackle bigger problems in a few minutes.
I mean, this is, again, where it's really hard to say this is what people should be doing, or these are the tools, or these are the steps, because a couple things. One, like we've been talking about, it just depends on what the problem is. The other thing is it seems like in general, people are actually pretty effective at solving their problems when they have the resources to do so, when they actually are able to carve out time, when they're able to listen to what the partner says. Importantly, do perspective taking. Like, I might hear that my partner says I'm frustrated about whatever, but like, if you just take a step back and think, okay, what would this actually feel like if I was in my partner's shoes right now and she was going through that, and if I was going through that, like, that helps a tremendous amount. This is, again, kind of where I feel like I'm kind of giving a little bit of generic advice, but direct communication is super effective. In relationships, oftentimes we play a lot of like little games with one another of I'm giving you the silent treatment, or I'm sulking, and I'm not going to tell you what's wrong because if you really loved me, you would know what's wrong. Drop all that. I don't know what I can say on that. Drop all that stuff, and just be direct with the person. Tell the person what you are actually thinking, what you actually want, what you're going through, and then be receptive to what they're giving you in return. Be receptive when they say, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I want, this is what I'm going through. Process that. Think about that. Don't just pay lip service to that and say, okay, I got you. No, actually put yourself in their shoes and think about it. And I feel like when both people accurately assess what both people are going through, you can find solutions to these problems, assuming they're solvable problems. Again, if we're dealing with like health issues, poverty, things like that. Those are going to be really difficult issues to deal with. But again, if the issues are like what you were describing of, I hate it that he leaves his shoes out at night and I trip over them, or we can't figure out where to go to dinner and things like that. If you've got the time and you're putting in, again, kind of, I don't want to say putting in the work, but if you're doing that, you should be able to resolve those solvable problems.
And I would say one thing that I would add to that is that if you're having a seemingly something that is sort of a very practical, tangible problem that has some possibly easy solutions, but it feels like the biggest problem in your relationship, then most likely there's something deeper underlying that's going on, which is, it's so they feel disrespected or unvalued, or you never want to go, you don't care where I want to go to eat for dinner, you don't care about my feelings, you're disrespecting me by leaving the shoes.
Can be symbolic.
And that's where I think it kind of does lead to the bigger, because, if those are problems that are surface level, you can easily come up with, okay, we'll take turns who's doing this, problem solved, let's move on, everybody's happy. But if it kind of brings up more, then you do need to get honest with it kind of goes back to that being realistic. Like, you do need to get honest with yourself and with each other about, like, why is something that should be a relatively small problem, why is that, like, escalated? And
sometimes those small problems seem like big problems in the moment because it has a little bit to do with the small problem, but there have been a lot of small problems along the way. Because oftentimes we don't want to be a nag, we don't want to criticize, we don't want to do any of that stuff. We want our partners to actually like us, so we want to be pleasant around them. So because of that, oftentimes, all these little things that come up, we say, I'm not going to address that. I'm not going to address that. I'm not going to, I hate that he does this, and I hate that he does that, and this annoys me, and that annoys me. But those are all minor things. I should just let it go. I should let it go. And then by the 12th one, then you're like, exactly. And the poor person is sitting there going, well, okay, I'll load the dishwasher in a different way. I'm sorry. And that is going to start the problem resolution process off on the wrong foot, because the one person is thinking you are going nuts about the dishwasher, and you're not going nuts about the dishwasher, you're going nuts because there have been 12 different times where you haven't cleaned up after yourself, or something like that. This is now a pattern, and I'm actually upset about the pattern. I'm not upset about this one little event, or maybe I'm a little upset, but it's not that big of a deal. But what I'm really concerned with is this bigger pattern of what's going on.
So I think a good takeaway there is sort of don't wait for something to become a problem. If you notice a difference between you, talk about the difference. It doesn't even have to be a problem, but just like, I wonder why they load the dishwasher this way, or I wonder why they leave their shoes out. Let's talk about it at that point rather than the point of waiting. But I see we have a question. Are you okay if we go and take a question from one of our listeners?
Yes, so this question has to do a little bit with the discussion now, as well as the bumper sticker that you brought up earlier. But is there sort of a strategy to help find that balance of when you should address something small versus when you should just let it go?
Yeah. My take is that, I think, Christine, what you were just saying is true of you don't want to let the small things go to the point where they're going to build up. And I think, so I kind of have two ideas on this one. One is just being honest with yourself about, do I think this is going to snowball into a bigger problem? Like, just sitting there thinking to myself, if my partner continues chewing loudly or whatever they're doing to bug me, if they continue to do this for the next 25 years, am I going to be really annoyed 25 years from now? And I think we can do that, but oftentimes we just we lie to ourselves and we're like, no, it'll be fine. So I think you need to kind of, evaluate that. And if the answer is no, it annoys me, but it's going to be fine, then maybe don't, make it an issue. But if you do think it's going to increase in severity, then, address it when it's smaller. The other thing is, that I think is really important is kind of calibrating the approach to the severity of the current severity of the problem, right? So this is a small issue now. So yeah, maybe I need to mention it to my partner that this is kind of annoying me a little bit, but I don't need to go in like guns blazing and be like, this is a huge deal and you need to stop this and, whatever. This is a small problem, so we're going to treat it like a small problem. we're not going to ignore it, but we need to treat it like it's a small problem. If it's a big problem, we need to treat it like it's a big problem. If it's not going to be a problem, we don't need, then we can ignore it.
Yeah, so I think too it goes back, especially for, so I would answer that question probably very differently also if it's a dating relationship versus once you're committed and in the marriage. And, you know, because I think while you're dating, I think even before, I would go back even before somebody's even dating, to really take time to think about, well, what are sort of people, you know, kind of sometimes call them the deal breakers, or what are your non-negotiables? You know, like one issue that often comes up is one person wants to have kids, the other person doesn't. There's no compromise there. So you better be pretty clear before you go into a relationship if either, you know, what you want is what that other person wants, or if you can be okay with it if not. And so I think sometimes we even need to back up on this even before a relationship begins.
Absolutely.
But then, you know, while dating, I think that's a really important time too to be really evaluating that relationship. And then once you're in that committed, if it's a marriage or if you really, you know, moved in together or whatever, the level of commitment also. And I think to some extent, people in a really committed relationship, of course, part of being committed is being committed to working through the issues that come up.
Absolutely.
But I also think, you know, to some extent, there also needs to be a little more patience and grace that's extended when you're in a commitment. And realistically, and I would make an exception if we're talking about like abusive relationships or safety, that's different. But to some extent, if it's like, you know, if it's taking a person longer to make changes that you want them to make or whatever, once you're really committed, you've got to also add a lot of patience onto problem solving.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that, I think, you know, we're in agreement that considering the level of commitment is so important. And I think there are, you know, my take, I like focusing on commitment rather than kind of like relationship status, dating, married, you know, especially as more recently, just fewer and fewer people are getting married or they're cohabitating for a long periods of time. Or so many of my friends are like, no, we've been together for 15 years now and we're never getting married. So like I like focusing on commitment because, you know, their relationships look just like married relationships, but they just don't want to go through that process. But yes, commitment is so important. When we are in committed relationships, we tend to, I don't want to say we deal with more, but we put up with more for oftentimes for good reasons. You know, if you're dating someone and you discover things you don't like about them, it is very easy to say, okay, this was great, but let's move on. You don't do that generally if you've been with someone for a long period of time or if you're married to someone. And I liked also that you pointed out that, you know, abuse is kind of a different category. And I think what I'd add to that is I think there are, you know, even though, yes, in general, we tend to have a higher threshold for problems when we are in committed relationships, and in general, I think that's very good. We also need to be cognizant of what still goes beyond that threshold. And I think like abuse is kind of one of those situations where I think most people would go, yeah, abuse, it goes beyond that threshold, and you know, even if you're married to that person, maybe you need to, you know, get out. But I think there are probably a lot of other things too that kind of go beyond that threshold. It's also really idiosyncratic. That you know, for some people, if I found out my partner cheated on me, you'd be really hurt by it. But yes, let's continue with this. For other people, you cheated on me, we're done. Right. So it does depend on the person and depends on the relationship. But when we are more committed, that threshold does get higher. I don't want to say we're willing to deal with more, but we're going to work harder to solve those problems. I think that's what I should be focusing on.
I always think one of the most important things that contribute to the success of a relationship is people being willing to work on it. And and I think that's one of the hard things. I think even in really long-term committed relationships, the reality is sometimes people do start to take each other for granted. And that does lead me to another question, which is, you know, what if one person is really wanting to work on a problem and their partner is like, I'm not interested, you know, good luck with this, I'm not changing. You know, what advice would you give to somebody who is motivated when they're dealing? And you might have learned some of this from your study on depression too. Like, what do you do, whether because of depression or other reasons?
I was going to say, I mean, this is one question I did kind of see in advance, and I really don't have any great ideas. And I almost feel like this is a question that you're, as a family and marital counselor, this is something that you know about, because like one thing I do know is that like the vast majority of people who go into couples therapy, one person is driving that.
Yeah.
You know, one person wants things to improve and fix this, and the other person is either oblivious to it and just is like, no, we're fine, I don't know, whatever, or the other person has their foot out the door already,
right.
and it's they want to be out, the other person wants to make things better. But I do know oftentimes that when people come to therapy, it's because one person is really driving this. How do you, like when you see those clients or when you're training people to work with those relationships, what do you do?
Who's doing the interview?
I know, right? I'm sorry. I'm bouncing this right back.
No, that's it's a really great question, and it's definitely something that can be a struggle for people. But I think that it also relates to some of my other research related to domestic violence too. Like, what do you do? Like, if you want to stop with the other person. But I think that, first of all, it's important to take care of yourself and do the things that you need to do in that situation, whether it's going for individual counseling, just good self-care, yoga, walking, eating healthy, you know, because that can be very stressful. I think trying, you know, different approaches is helpful. You know, maybe backing off and giving the person some space for some time. Sometimes it's about, you know, putting a little bit more, you know, not pressure, but a little bit more like directness into saying, like, we really need to work on this. I really need you to be part of this. And then I think it's also realizing that one person can influence change in a relationship, so you can potentially start to change things on your own that might lead to changes in the other person. And I think going for individual counseling can be helpful. One little trick I remember learning when I was in school for marriage, learning about marriage and couple counseling would be, you can say to your partner, you know, well, I would like to go to counseling and I will be talking about the relationship, and I would really love for you to join me, but just so you know, if you're not willing to come, I'm going to go to take care of myself, and I will be talking about the relationship and making some decisions.
And it still gives them that autonomy, that
they're
making that choice.
But you're also protecting yourself in that situation and kind of setting a boundary. So I would say those are a few things. I think that that's very difficult, but as you said, it's very common, you know, which is why I would back up to even for those who are dating or before even entering a relationship, looking for somebody who has that growth mindset that we've been talking about, and somebody that's willing to, you know, kind of say, okay, I'm not perfect. There's probably things I need to work on. Let's, you know, kind of work together. And
that's, I mean, kind of the one thing that came to mind is just, like you said, almost like taking a step back and figuring out, like, well, why doesn't this person want to address this problem? Or, like, why doesn't this person want to go to therapy? Or even if they're not going to therapy or anything like that, but it's like, why does this person not want to address this problem? Do they not want to address it because everything's going fine for them? Maybe they're doing something that is negatively impacting me, but it doesn't bother them. You know, it's not negatively impacting them at all. So having that understanding might help. I think, again, this is where I kind of go, the first step is just accurately assessing what's going on. And then once you have that understanding, again, assuming both people are rational people and assuming you have the time to kind of think about and process everything, you know, oftentimes those problems, I don't want to say they work themselves out, but having that understanding of what's driving it definitely helps.
I agree, and I think also putting, like, you know, like you said earlier, like putting yourself in that person's shoes and saying, maybe they don't feel that they can change it, and so their resistance is kind of a defense mechanism almost to say, no, I'm not willing to work on this. Maybe they can't change it. I know or they're just not ready. And I know that I've talked with a lot of people who've experienced like recovery from addiction, and they basically have said, you know, until I was ready, it doesn't matter what anybody says to me. It doesn't matter what anybody does. I'm not going to work on it. You know, and it gets back to that point then that the person who is willing to work on it then really has to say, okay, what am I doing here, and what can I change? I see we have another question. I know we're down to the last 5 or so minutes of our program. I know time goes really quickly.
Absolutely.
I guess we'll
end with a more general question, which is, do you recommend any general steps that couples can use to tackle problems?
General steps.
So let's say we started with the realistic assessment.
Right,
and
that's exactly what I was,
after that.
yeah. That's what I was kind of going to start with is, I mean, I think the first thing is trying to understand the problem. It's trying to understand kind of the scope of the problem. Is this just an issue about one specific thing, you loading the dishwasher or whatever, or is this a bigger issue, like I think that you are just generally a messy person? You know, kind of understanding the scope of it. Trying to understand the causes of it, what is causing the person to behave, you know, how they're behaving or say the things they're saying. So yeah, I think the first step is just understanding the problem. It's understanding the severity, the scope. From there, it's looking for solutions. I think that's the second big step is figuring out, okay, what can we do as a couple to resolve this? And solutions are going to look very different depending on what the problem is. So this is kind of another case where I'd say I don't know if I have any like advice that would apply to everything, but you know, certain types of problems are going to require different solutions. And recognizing that also this stage of identifying solutions is a dyadic stage. This is a conversation between you and the partner, and you know, the two of you are working together to come up with a solution. You might think this is going to be really effective. The partner might think something else is going to be effective. You guys need to be working through that and talking about that and coming to some sort of agreement about that. From there, it's actually implementing those solutions. I think this is kind of another area where I mean, maybe this is just anecdotally, but like where things fall apart. Like when I'm thinking of like, you know, things that I've problems I've had in relationships, either romantic relationships or friendships or things like that. And you know, we can say, okay, well, we should spend more time together. And we're like, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to have, you know, regular date nights. Every week we're going to go on a date night and whatever. And that works really well for, you know, 2 weeks, and then real life hits, and then suddenly it's every other week we're going on date night. And then it's now every other month. And so actually implementing that is so important because you can find that solution to it, but you actually have to do that solution. And, you know, after that, it's kind of reevaluating it, seeing like, did that actually work or not? Did this actually, are we in a better place? Did this help? If it didn't help, why did this help? Did we not actually understand what was going on, and maybe we need to come up with new solutions because we didn't really understand the problem before? Maybe it helped reduce it, but we need to still do more things. You know, like, yes, I'm finding that these regular date nights help me feel closer to my spouse, but maybe I need to do a little bit more on top of that. Maybe we should be showing more affection, or, you know, something like that. Maybe you need to add something. So I think it's assessment, figuring out what you need to do, actually doing it, and then reevaluating.
And then maybe doing something
and
else.
Then it's cyclical. It's going back.
Cycle,
yeah, absolutely.
Which actually, as you were talking, it really made me think, like, no wonder problem solving is so difficult for couples, because it really takes a lot of intention. It takes a lot of dedication to kind of beginning to actually address problems in relationships, to seeing that problem solving process through, to understand that you might try a solution. You might try date nights and it works great and everything's solved, and you might try date nights and it's like, you know, that wasn't it.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the relationship is doomed, or that you're doomed, or that there's no hope. It just means maybe what you need is not a date night, but you need, you know, to sit and talk 10 minutes every night and talk about something deeper, you know, or like holding hands or whatever. It's just whatever it might be, and I think to keep that growth mindset through the process.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's so important to recognize that the other person might not be at the exact same stage that you're at. Like, you might be at that stage where I've already figured out the solution and I want to implement that solution. The other person doesn't even know that there's a problem going on, and then you kind of have to resolve that in some way of getting the other person to even see that there's a problem, getting that person to be motivated to want to tackle that problem. And so, you know, if we're thinking about these in steps or stages, it's not like it's the couple moving through these stages. It's really each individual moving through these stages, hopefully together.
Yeah. Well, and I could sit and talk about this all day. It's very interesting. We didn't even get through about half of the questions we had thought we might talk about, but do you have any final thoughts?
Final thought, I think like we've been saying, you know, every problem is different. You know, you wouldn't use the same tool for every job in the same way that, you know, how you go about trying to solve your problems. It really depends on the problem that you're facing. It depends on the other person that you're with. And I mean, just be mindful of that, of again, kind of like know when do I need to be a little bit more critical versus when do I need to be a little bit more positive? When do I need to be a little bit more supportive? Or, you know, the tools that we use really should depend on the situation. So that's my big take home, is that recognizing that process is so important, and recognizing that your partner is going to change over time, both kind of long term, but then also just day to day, hour to hour, and kind of just being mindful of that process, I think, is so important too.
That's great. That's a great recap of pretty much everything we talked about today. And I would just add to that too, my kind of final thought is just to keep hope alive. It's hard this is hard. It's not easy. There's a reason why a lot of relationships, you know, don't go the distance, but to, you know, stay committed, to have really positive but realistic expectations, especially if you're dealing with a really major challenge, that to just keep that growth mindset going and keep the hope alive for it. So we want to thank everybody for being with us today, and thank you, Levi, for the great discussion. It was really interesting, especially learning more about your research. For those of you who have joined us today, before you sign off, we would just really invite you to take the feedback form and just share your thoughts on today's program, any suggestions or anything that you liked or other topics that you'd like to see covered in Relationship Boosters. Our next Relationship Booster is going to be on Friday, June 14th, and our topic is healthy relationships in older adulthood. And just as a little heads up that we are shifting these programs to be just once a month over the summer, and then it'll be back to the first and third Friday starting in September. So we'll be just probably in the next week or so, we'll be releasing the upcoming schedule for the rest of 2019 for these programs. So stay tuned at the website, the Relationship Boosters website. But thanks so much again for being here today, and we hope that this information helps you to solve problems more effectively.